Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 792. It is February the 9th, 1987. There was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle this morning that Caspar Weinberger and the powers that be in the Pentagon are asking $35 billion for top-secret military spending. That's triple what Ronald Reagan started spending in 1981 when he became president. The purpose of the triple spending is to create weapons that you do not know about. They don't have to divulge the nature of these weapons. It is called a black budget, and Congress is supposed to have little or no knowledge of what the Pentagon is doing. It is a fact that the members of a Congress are elected through the 50 states to govern this country and not the Pentagon, and they want this huge amount, $35 billion this year and for the following years for their secret budgets. Now, one of the projects they have, which I mentioned on the air about a year ago, are plans for World War IV. If you can believe anything this crazy, the Pentagon has elaborate plans for winning a month-long nuclear war and a subsequent war. They will have robots stalking radioactive battlegrounds, satellites orchestrating nuclear attacks, generals speeding along interstates in lead-lined trucks ordering warheads fired from faraway silos. This past weekend, there was the first International Film Festival on the Monterey Peninsula, and there were quite a few wonderful movies. In fact, I managed to see 7 of them in 3 days. In 2 days, rather, if you believe it. No, it was Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, 3 days, and I saw 7 movies. The not the most interesting, but the one I want to share with you that is pertinent to World War III is a movie called A Half-Life, and it was produced by Dennis O'Rourke. It was made in Australia, and it's a story of what happened when the United States dropped the hydrogen bomb on the Marshall Islands and the people there. And the winds were hitting the area of the islands, and they knew that the wind would go that way. And the American ships were there to evacuate the people, but left the people on the islands so that for subsequent years and up to the present time, and there's litigation going on now to defend these people and what happened to them, they had their flesh burned, their genes were altered, there were stillbirths, their hydrocephalics, children totally deformed that they carry around with and buggies or wagons with no bodily functions, cancers, and some were brought to the United States and tested within a short time period and then subsequently, and they keep following up the tests of these people. And this was done purposely on the Marshall Island, and it was the time period when Eisenhower was president and Richard Nixon was vice president, and they referred to those natives as savages. They dropped the hydrogen bomb to test what they called the savages. In the Doomsday Dictionary, which is a marvelous book, it was written in 1963 by Donald Kaplan and Armin Schwenner, there's a description of the hydrogen bomb under fission bomb. And it says this is also the FFF bomb is the hydrogen bomb, the H bomb, the fusion bomb, the super thermonuclear bomb. Unveiled first by the United States, March the 1st, 1954, and that's the time period this movie was about, that bombing. March the 1st, 1954, at Bikini in the Pacific. This is the bomb which finally appeased the technological appetite for truly large-yield weapons, thereby releasing the intellectual and financial resources for an earnest development of missile weapons. It is this bomb, combined with an intercontinental missile, that originally inspired the epithet, the absolute weapon. Well, to see the photographs of the people today, this was taken just recently, 1985 film, and the progress by which their bodies were burned and the children mutilated, and to realize how much farther we've gone, and to experience that movie this weekend, and then to read the following morning, the plans for 35 billion of secret bombs that we don't know anything about, shows how little we've learned and how pathetic we are in terms of relating to our world and what we are doing with our intellect and our money. And to make matters even worse or even sadder, I have to tell you, I went to that movie after seeing a morning film. It was a 10 o'clock film on Chile, which was very good, and I'll do more about that later on World Watchers. But up the street, a theater 2 blocks away, was the movie Half-Life, the title coming from the fact that everyone there that was victim to the hydrogen bomb testing, they were told they could expect a half-life, and the half that they were to live, of course, was miserable and sick, and they were eating radiated food and fish and so forth, and they weren't warned or told, and it wasn't removed from their presence. But I went over to that film with a friend. We'd seen the Chilean movie, and there was one other couple in the theater. There were 4 people, 50% of them world watchers, my friend and myself, and 2 other people that were sitting about 10 rows behind us. Now, the film festival was very successful. There were black tie parties. There were balls Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, even Sunday night, where 600-700 people attended. A lot of movie and television stars. Ed Asner was up here. He wasn't at the Chilean movie. He wasn't at the Half-Life movie. He's a celebrity of a cause, such as Nicaragua, and then after his press conferences and so forth, he disappears. Maybe a ball or 2, and he disappears. Many of the obviously more popular movies had 600 or 700 people attending. 4 people attended that movie on Half-Life, on the hydrogen bomb, and taking in consideration that this very week the president is asking money for World War III. What makes you think that you won't be described as a savage, or we are considered, I know, as native population, people that could be wiped out? The Defense Department has their plans for the survivability of those people that they are arranging to survive, and then the number 4 war after that. Totally sick, the plans that they're doing, totally sick, the fact that we give them the money and the power, that Pentagon, that faceless group of people headed by Fritz Kramer and his gang, and totally pathetic that more people didn't come out to see Half-Life. It's really, really a very sad day for this country, or each day is, as it moves towards that War 4, with the intention of being a nuclear war, and no guarantee, of course, of where those bombs are going to fall, and or how easily it will be easy to die. Just assuming it'll fall on your head and you die. It doesn't always happen that easy. On the NBC Nightly News this past week, February the 5th, Tom Brokaw announced, and they had pictures of the Colombia cocaine kingpin, Carlos Leder Rivas, R-A-V-I-S. He uses the name Leder, in Spanish. They use that middle name as their proper name. Carlos Leder Rivas, and he was brought in, the cocaine king from Colombia, described by Tom Brokaw quickly on television as a partner of Robert Vesco, or a former partner. I didn't say he isn't currently a partner because the people they work with are the same cocaine connections and absolutely working together. But they mentioned Robert Vesco's name in conjunction with the arrest of Carlos Leder Rivas. Then on the CBS Evening News that came on 1 hour later, February the 5th, 1987, the news announced that Mr. Leder is an advocate of Adolf Hitler. He is, in fact, what you would call an outright Nazi. He prefers Hitler and Mussolini, and when he runs for political offices in Colombia, he has his picture, the pictures of the 2 men, and he stands between them. So it was much to my surprise to see stations such as NBC and CBS talking in the same breath, in the same evening, about Robert Vesco and Adolf Hitler and Colombia cocaine. Just last week on World Watchers, broadcast number 791, that was February the 2nd, 1987, 3 days before Leder Rivas was arrested, I began a section that was to go further into the cocaine traffic of South America, and very timely indeed, as I say, just days before the arrest. And I mentioned the chief counsel for the investigation of the Contragate for the Senator Inouye Committee, Arthur Lyman, L-I-M-A-N, and I talked about him coming from the law office of Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison, and that Simon Rifkin set up that company, TCI, that later became Stanford Technology, that involved Otto von Bolschwing, the chief Nazi of the Western world. When Reinhard Gehlen went back to Germany to head up the BND, von Bolschwing traveled between Sacramento and Silicon Valley and Europe and South America as the liaison of Adolf Hitler's particular agents for after World War II, to continue that great Fourth Reich, get into the Fourth Reich. TCI had several subsidiaries, and I mentioned Advanced Information Systems and International Imaging System. And now IIS was taken over by Edwin Wilson and Albert Hakim from Iran, and General Secord and Thomas Cline of the CIA and Theodore Shackley of the CIA. It became Stanford Technology. And I also mentioned that Mr. Lehman, however you pronounce it, the chief investigator for the Senate committee, is an attorney for Robert Vesco, which puts you exactly in the lap of the Nazis, and TCI and Stanford Technology, which I was saying last week, and also Willard Zucker, the Geneva businessman and business partner of Robert Vesco, who helped found CSF in 1971, runs the Swiss banks that are linked both to Iran and to Contragate between the Middle East, and this is a large hunk of the drug traffic that goes through the hands of these people. And Zucker handles the CSF, the account of the Contra funding, drug money in Panama, Vesco's accounts, Albert Hakim, Theodore Shackley, General Secord, John Singlaub, and Thomas Cline's. And also this same law firm represents Henry Kissinger. And I was citing the conflict of interest of having this investigator with links to the Nazi Odessa network, the Galen network, the CIA, and to Robert Vesco, the Nazis and the drug running. I was talking about that briefly just on World Watchers last week, on the last part of the program. And then 3 days later, they brought in the powers that be, brought in the cocaine kingpin, Carlos Leder Rivas, from Colombia. Now, why did they bring him in at this time? He has an interesting background, and I believe they had to bring him in just as Klaus Barbie was arrested, to hush him up because he's so heavily involved in so many tentacles of the Contragate and directly involved, as close as you can be, to those persons relating to Vice President George Bush, former CIA director, who has a big role in all those persons being netted and mentioned in these particular operations at this time. The LA Times, February the 6th, had an article about Mr. Leder Rivas, and also the Los Angeles Times, February the 5th and the 6th, and the San Jose Mercury, and most of your newspapers around the country had stories about him. And there's just a few things I want to cite about this gentleman who was arrested. He's involved with Colombia's massive cocaine cartel. They announced right away that arresting him won't stop the cocaine traffic from coming in. It will continue. But the purpose, of course, of arresting him at this time, I believe, is to shut him up, and his links to the vice president and to the White House and to Ollie North and General John Singlaub, and a network of generals and CIA intelligence agents linked directly to the cocaine traffic. He was indicted in Jacksonville, Florida in 1981 on cocaine importing charges. He was indicted again in Miami with 8 others on 39 counts of narcotics-related offenses. He was closely associated with Pablo Escobar, Jorge, it's J-O-R-G, Jorge is pronounced Ochoa, O-C-H-O-A, and Fabio, O-C-H-O-A, Ochoa, who are brothers. They make up a group of 4 that run the Medellin cartel. That's Medellin, Colombia. They come from Medellin, Colombia. Escobar is worth about $1 billion. The Ochoa brothers are not far behind. And Leder Rivas, of course, is worth many, many millions, almost $1 billion. Now, Mr. George Hoche, O-C-H-O-A, and Mr. Escobar are defendants in that Christic Institute lawsuit on charges of murder, attempted murder, agents provocateurs, drug dealing, gun running of the Contras. So that while those 2 men have been swept into the suit that involves links directly to the national security and the White House, they brought in the big boss because he is somebody to hush up if the others have to go to trial, and keep him locked up because he absolutely knows too much. Later, Rivas' father was born in Germany. He has a German father who's an engineer. His mother is from Colombia. He was educated in New York and was arrested on drug charges by the age of 18. He returned to Colombia and made his first $1 million by the time he was 23 years old. probably with the help of the engineer father, the German engineer father. He bought an island in the Bahamas, which is in 1978, which is the Norman Cay. And if you remember, during a time period, I'll have to look up the exact dates in the Bahamas, Robert Vesco tried to influence the coup in Dominica to take over the island of Dominica. And that operation involved Nazis and Klan members, the highest level, from the United States and from up in Canada, and also John Connolly, who is on the board of Permindex, part of the Permindex operation, the international group that were behind political assassinations. And while Vesco didn't get his island, that was to be a Nazi strong base for drug dealing and Nazism, in Central America, Mr. Leder Rivas has his particular island. It has a 3,300-foot runway protected by radar, Doberman attack dogs, and so forth. He is dedicated to the philosophy of Adolf Hitler, and as I say, when he's in Colombia campaigning for his far-right political group, he stands between pictures of Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. He has his own private disco where he has parties, and the disco is dedicated to the late Beatle John Lennon. There's a statue of John Lennon in the disco, wearing a helmet, holding a guitar, stark naked with a bullet through the heart. This reminds me very much of the Manson family, where they were Nazis and drug dealers and used the title Helter Skelter of one of the Beatles songs to write with blood on the refrigerator of the Bianca family when they were murdered. And then the chief prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi, continued the identification of John Lennon with violence and the far right by writing the book Helter Skelter, which was about the Manson family but used the title of a Beatles song. The Medellin cartel group had offered $500,000 for the murder of Drug Enforcement Agent Barry Seal. Barry Seal used to drive Jorge Agca around. He was his airplane pilot and flew him, and he was involved in delivering narcotics. And Agca, as I say, is a defendant in the Christic Institute lawsuit with people like Singlab, Secord, Thomas Clines, Oliver North, Robert Owens, direct links to the White House and the National Security Council. The narcotics traffic was used for Mr. Hull's ranch in Costa Rica, which formerly belonged to Robert Vesco, a partner of Mr. Leder Rivas, and also the client of the chief counsel for the Senate committee, and also for Mr. Zucker over in Switzerland, where the drug money is deposited and then transferred down to various banks in Panama and around the Caribbean. There's in many Swiss banks, there's 7 at least, but there's many more, I'm sure, and this has been going on for a long time. The arrest of this gentleman is very important at this time, as I say, because of his links to persons very, very high up, and I don't think that they could afford to have him out free anymore. There have been a lot of murders in Colombia, murders of newspaper people, and the former prime minister was murdered just last month in Hungary in front of the embassy, the Colombian embassy, and before that, the other prime minister from Colombia was murdered. So that there have been lists of hundreds of murders that have taken place. There was an article in the Bay Guardian recently, December 1986 issue, with a cast of characters of the Contragate affair, and they've listed a group of defendants in that lawsuit filed by the Christic Institute. And among them, of course, are Thomas Clines of the CIA, Pablo Escobar, the partner, the cocaine partner of Mr. Carlos Leder Rivas, who was just picked up. And this is why I think it's so important to pick him up. Albert Hakim, who's the link to Mr. Khashoggi, Adnan Khashoggi, and the late Hashemi, and the gun running and narcotics traffic that came out of Iran and now continues through Pakistan and Afghanistan and so forth. John Hull is listed in this cast of characters, and as I say, his property is the former property of Mr. Robert Vesco. He's very familiar with the Costa Rica connections. And another defendant in the Christic Institute is Jorge Agca, the citizen of Colombia. He escaped from the authorities while waiting extradition to Florida, and he's out floating around. And Robert Owen, the president of ID Incorporated, the liaison to Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, Tom Posey from Alabama. But the important thing is that the people involved and the partners with Mr. Carlos Letter Rivas, are involved and are defendants in a lawsuit placed in court in the United States regarding political assassinations, agents provocateurs, gun running, and narcotics traffic. And the big guy, the boss or overlord of all of them, even though he's very young, was just picked up this past week and brought to the United States. There was an article in the Los Angeles Times, December 21st, 1986, titled "The Heart of the Scandal." And this goes into the Contra war in Nicaragua and how Congress is giving too much attention to the Iranian arms deals because it's an emotional issue, because they have the hostages, but that the allegations that Ronald Reagan made that Nicaragua was doing the drug dealing were not true. And this article goes on to say the DEA had no evidence to substantiate President Reagan's charges, which is tantamount to saying that Ronald Reagan is a source of disinformation and lies coming from the president himself. And this article about the heart of the scandal goes into a man named Adler Barry Seal, who set up cocaine shipments from Colombia to the United States. And then, of course, later he was murdered. I'll do more on that later. Seal was gunned down in New Orleans in a parking lot of February last year. And the gun that killed him is linked to the regular Contra group that do the assassinations. And there was a fee of $500,000 to kill Seal. And I guess these fellows really earned their money. They defined what they wanted, and they got it. The Heart of the Scandal article also refers to the contacts of President George Bush, and I want to update more on that, with Mr. Rodriguez, the well-known El Salvadorian agent Felix Rodriguez, who's worked with the CIA going back to or maybe before the Bay of Pigs. George Bush met with Rodriguez 3 times in the White House or buildings nearby, and the meetings were attended by Oliver North and Mr. Carr, the the current U.S. ambassador to El Salvador, Edwin Carr, C-O-R-R. And Felix Rodriguez is the link to Klaus Barbie, to the murder of Che Guevara, to the Nazi Fascistas International, that includes Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, and Argentina, the South American death squads. But George Bush is tied directly to and was meeting with these people. And this same article on the heart of the scandal goes into the Cuban airlines that were blown up and the fact that George Bush was CIA director at the time. And one of the persons responsible for blowing that up was Mr. Posada-Medina. And he's prominent in this. And this one article, The Heart of the Scandal, identifies people with those Nazi connections, the drug connections, the national security, and the CIA connections, and it is a very important article. And bringing in Mr. Rivas at this time is important because he links to the highest levels of the intelligence community, the Nazis, Robert Vesco, and so forth. Now, George Bush has had a very busy time covering up his bases, or somebody's covering them up for him, and while he looks pretty mealy-mouthed, you can't underestimate George Bush, the CIA director. And I just want to cite about 10 dates of events that have taken place recently, and I believe they're all related to George Bush's contacts that I've mentioned earlier, and other ones that are very, very pertinent. In March of 1985, Stephen Carr, one of the persons that was working with the cocaine traffickers, the assassins known as the Contras, he left 9 letters to release if he was murdered, and he was murdered just this fall in 1986 in Los Angeles. These letters, he said, would topple the government and implicate the National Security Council and the Reagan administration. February the 20th in 1986, Adler Barry Seal was murdered, the pilot for Mr. Jose Osha, and a very important person whose testimony revealed that it was not the Nicaraguans doing the drug traffic, but the Contras. This was after $500,000 was offered to kill him by the team that are defendants in the Christic Institute trial, and also Mr. Rivas, Letter Rivas. July 22nd, 1986, Fabio Osha, Pablo Escobar, and Rafael Cardona were indicted for the Seal murder. Escobar, again, working with the NSC and the CIA links. August the 4th, 1986, 1 month later, Jesus Garcias, a cocaine trafficker, referred to Colombia leader Letter Rivas, his operation, as George Bush's baby. This came from an article from the Miami Herald that Ted Rubenstein got for David Emery and myself, August the 4th, 1984, and it started to reveal those cocaine links to the highest level of our government. December 13th, 1986, the other wasn't 84, it was 1986. December 13th, 1986, Stephen Carr was murdered in Los Angeles. He played a very major role in this operation and felt in 1985 he would be killed. In the Los Angeles Police Department, and Daryl Gates tried to cover it up as if it were a suicide, and it is directly linked to the same LAPD that worked with Squad 19, with Mullen Associates, with the Defense Department and the CIA trying to cover the murder of Stephen Carr. So two primary witnesses in this case were killed, one in February and one in December. December the 16th, 3 days later after Stephen Carr was murdered, CIA Director William Casey, linked to all of the above and more, and this doesn't even deal with the Iranian contacts and the drug connections, had a seizure in the CIA building where George Bush was once director, and from then on, Casey's brains were fried, and for all purposes, he's of no value to testify or fill in any pieces. February the 4th, Donald Arnaud, George Bush's associate, a boat manufacturer, was gunned down in Miami, similar to a drug kind of a hit. He created fast boats for quick getaways for the DEA, and they were also used by the drug dealers. So Casey went in for brain surgery in the middle of December. By February, Donald Arnaud, linked down to the narcotics agents and people in the Miami area, was gunned down. The very next day, February the 5th, 1987, Armando Fernandez Larios was put into custody of the Americans, and he's a very important connection to George Bush. He works for DINA, the secret police in Chile. He surfaced because he was afraid that he said he'd be killed by the left and the right, and he had the same fears that he would be murdered, exactly like Stephen Carr, and he's asked for federal protection and a new name. He helped canvass the home of Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. for Michael Townley, and that was a story of a murder written up in Murder on Embassy Row, and there are very good books on the murder of Letelier and Moffat, and of course, I've said for years that this is, and these books confirm all that, these murders are tied to the anti-Castro Cubans, to the CIA, to George Bush, who was CIA director at the time, to Michael Townley, who worked for the Central Intelligence Agency and was an agent in that liaison area of colonial dignidad with the highest Nazis between Chile and Argentina. This past week, February the 5th, Carlos Letter Rivas was brought in. What I'm trying to say in chronological order is that Carr was murdered. Just at the end of the year, Casey went in with a brain surgery. Donald Arnaud, this past week, was gunned down in Miami with links to Bush and the drug connections. The next day, Armando Fernandez Larios was in the custody of Americans, telling the role of particular agents, including Augusto Pinochet, going right up to the top of ordering the murder of Letelier. And then February the 5th, Carlos Letter Rivas is brought in from Colombia to Florida for trial. The cocaine king is safe in the hands of the United States. He has these connections that I mentioned to the Nazis, to Robert Vesco, to the same Swiss banks, the same airplanes that were drug dealing, to the CIA, to the International Fascista. And the very next day after he was brought in, George Bush sent a letter, according to the Los Angeles Times, thanking the Colombian President Barco for capturing Letter Rivas and bringing him to the United States. It was an absolute necessity, I believe, that he had to be into the custody here where he would have as few interviews as possible and couldn't blackmail the persons running this country from a jail in Florida or wherever they decide to put him, Louisiana or Florida. He's wanted on various charges. Now, Stephen Carr, who died in December of 1986, as I say, left messages and 9 letters to his brother about his role with these various people at Fort Lauderdale, his role with Felix Rodriguez, the CIA agent who met with Vice Presidential aide Donald Gregg, G-R-E-G-G, and all of these agents linked directly to George Bush and the office of George Bush and the Central Intelligence Agency. And Carr told federal authorities the major players in the arms supply network were involved in the shipment of drugs, including Tom Posey, the head of the U.S. mercenary group called Civilian Materiel Assistance, Robert Owen, a liaison to National Security Council advisor Oliver North, and Mr. Hull, who had some property in Costa Rica that formerly belonged to Robert Vesco. So that this past week, there's been a lot of actions in terms of gunning down a person in Miami. There was also another murder in Houston, Texas, drug-related. That's the home base of George Bush, and I'm not really sure how significant that is. But these people have links that go back many, many years, and the avenues of escape from the drug traffic, the Nazism, the fascism, and the assassinations and murders they've done is getting very, very interesting. It's hard for them to deny all the hard evidence that researchers have done through the years that is now being used by newspaper columnists and writers and computers that feed into this information to spread this story as quickly as possible. We'll take a 1-minute break, and I want to share with you some of the most important articles on these drug traffic stories and not detail them now, but just highlight what they are and then share more of them with you next week. This is Mae Brussell. In case you missed the first half of World Watchers, it is program number 792, and I'm going into some articles that have to do with drug running, Nazi connections, Contra operations, also drugs coming from the Middle East, from Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, diversion of funds for narcotics traffic. And I want to cite on the second half of the program some very important articles that have come out recently regarding just these particular agents I've talked about the first half hour, not the drug traffic in other places and other countries or the diversion of drug funds, but specifically the evolving of the drug story and not only the drug cocaine traffic, but the assassination teams and the importance of these people to Robert Vesco and to the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Council. I'll delve into that later. Several articles that I cite here, I'm going to outline them for you and get them on the air as soon as I can and share them with you. The first is from New Solidarity, March 21st, 1983. Now, that was written 3 years ago, just 3 years ago now, and it's about the links of Robert Vesco, the co-partner of Mr. Leder, and the Contras down in Costa Rica and presently at Cuba. It has to do with Robert Vesco's millions of dollars, the Sterling National Bank, the Michelle Sindona, and the Franklin National Bank in New York City, the links of these banks to narcotics traffics, to Maxwell Robb, our current ambassador to Rome, who's heavily involved with these operations, and to David Graver, who took $40 million out of Argentine, who is head of the American Bank and Trust Company, a member of the P2. And next week I'll do the relationship of these various agents and the millions of dollars they have taken out of various banks that have gone into such places as narcotics and maybe overseas Swiss banks for when that World War III, World War IV that Caspar Weinberger and Fred Eakley and Daniel Graham and Fritz Kramer cook up, the cash will be available for these particular people. There's a strong link of these agents, Sindona and Vesco and Graver and the P2, the Knights of Malta, and the cocaine traffic, and I'll do that hopefully next week. The next article pertaining to these matters is from the Executive Intelligence Review, January the 15th, 1985. The title is Bulgarian Justice, Robert Vesco and the Department of Justice, and the relationship of Henry Kissinger to drug traffic, to Robert Vesco with his intelligence sources and his Bulgarian connections. And because Vesco is a partner with people like Theodore Shackley and Ed Wilson and Frank Turpel, it's easy to see how Shackley and Turpel set up Agca with Francesco Pazienza to say that the Bulgarian connections were communist connections when the Pope was shot in 1981, in May of 81, but I'll do more material for you on articles on the American Express, the Bulgarian connections, Ali Agca, and Robert Vesco, and of course a lot of this team do have to do with drug traffic. The next large article, and the articles I'm citing for you, references on these matters, are not small stories. They're not 2 or 3 inches or 6 inches columns. The articles I'm citing for you again now are full newspaper pages or 2 pages or magazine type articles. There's no single small articles. The next section of material comes from the Center for National Security Studies, published in September 1985, titled Running the Nicaraguan War, the CIA and the Master of Contras. And this has to do with the FDN and Mr. Calero, a defendant in the lawsuit of Christic Institute, along with Mr. Escobar and Mr. Osha, and the drug-running people that have been doing the Contra operation for so long. Another large article came out March the 16th, 1986, and these were before the huge ContraGate story broke in September and October of 1986. This was March 16th, 1986, titled Inquiry Reported into Contra Arms Gun Running Cocaine Traffic, asking for an investigation. San Francisco Chronicle, April 11th, 1986. FBI probing the Contras, the drug, and the gun running. San Francisco Examiner, May 29th, 1986. Journalists will sue Contras in plot to kill Pastora. That has to do with the Christic Institute. They surfaced in May of 1986 with their indictments, and it has to do with assassinations, provocateurs, the CIA, National Security Council, plans to murder, and the people they've already murdered. Los Angeles Times, May the 8th, as a long article, Will a Bizarre Suit Become a Watergate in the Jungle? It's by Georgie Ann Geyer, and I cited that on World Watchers a while back, probably as early as May. In July, the Wall Street Journal had a long story, The Contra War Takes Casualties Within the National Security Council. At that point, Admiral Poindexter and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North had to be fired. And this drug story builds up with longer and larger articles, but it began immediately with the firing of Poindexter and North. San Jose Mercury, July 18th. Spotlight swings on Los Gatos mystery man Albert Hakim. And this is about TCI and Stanford Technology, and Hakim and John Singlaub are the middlemen between the Iranian drug traffic and the secret Swiss bank accounts that are used for narcotics traffic. And he is a defendant in the Christic Institute lawsuit for working with assassins, drug dealers, and the CIA and generals, military officers, retired military officers, disobeying the laws. And Hakim came from Iran to form TCI, and it form Stanford Technology, and it took over TCI after that, just closed its doors and moved on to become Stanford Technology. And that's the company I was talking about last week with the links to Otto von Bolschwing, and that goes into the drug trafficking, the weapons, and the heavy use of right wing, such as Otto von Bolschwing and his co-partner, Mr. Getty, who there's a book out about him now, had strong affiliations and sympathies for the Nazis, as does Mr. Leder Rivas. It isn't just belonging to a kook fringe in Colombia, this adoration of Adolf Hitler. Monterey Herald, August the 4th, had a story, Contra supporter tells of tangled schemes. This has to do with Jesus Garcia. Now, this was the Miami Herald, I'm sorry, and it refers to the cocaine traffickers and those people in Colombia as being Bush's baby, George Bush's baby. Washington Post, October 15th, web of U.S. Contra violations alleged in Senator Kerry's staff report. He turned in before the ContraGate really fell apart and started opening up like a flower. As the petals keep falling off, we learn new things every day. And Senator Kerry was working with Dan Sheehan of Christic Institute and beginning to notice the violations and calling attention to Congress. Washington Times, this is November 19th, Nicaraguan official tied to cocaine ring. Now, this is disinformation published by Reverend Moon's paper. The publisher is Arnaud de Borchgrave, who works with Michael Ledeen and those persons that created the Agca communist story, or the Billy Gates story for the elections, so Jimmy Carter would lose the elections in 1980. The authorities on terrorism that make up their stories as they go along. This all turned out to be disinformation, and this article explains that there was no evidence to support this thesis that Nicaragua was into the narcotics traffic. It's actually the Contras that are into the traffic, and in fact later there's articles saying that there's no evidence to support Ronald Reagan's charges that Nicaragua was in drug traffic. And of course Mr. Seal was one of those people who was the liaison between the drug traffic, and his murder took place, and then they could blame his testimony that it wasn't the Nicaraguans and try to pass off this lie if it would be possible. San Jose Mercury, November 19th, had a long story, cocaine kingpins indicted. drug lords from Colombia, and that's the Medellin cartel I referred to, and Jorge Osha, the same defendant in the Christic Institute, was named in this suit, and Pablo Escobar was named in the suit, and Juan, David, and Fabio Osha, the brother of Jorge. It involved billionaire partners of Mr. Later Rivas, who was arrested this week. November the 27th, 1986, the San Francisco Chronicle had a story, Senate arms prober assails the Justice Department. And this is an allegation by various people in the Senate investigating the Contragate story as of the last part of this past year, that the investigations were stalled by Admiral Poindexter and Oliver North and Edwin Meese, and they didn't want the Contra story to link to the Swiss banks and the Irangate scandals. Edwin Meese should actually be removed as the Attorney General of the United States because he doesn't belong in the first place, but the Justice Department in general is assailed for what they did, but Edwin Meese is responsible for diverting the law away from the books where it is written as law to opinions of what should be done that are good enough for the president and the powers that be, in his mind, in Washington, D.C. San Francisco Examiner, November 27th, had a long story, Senator links drug sales and Contras, and this has to do with Senator Kerry, who became more open about the Swiss banks, the cocaine, Oliver North, John Singlau, and that whole team. The People's World, November 28th, had a large story, Demand Independent Probe into Irangate, and this has to do with all the allegations of the Christic Institute and how necessary it was for a special independent prosecutor to go into these matters. As it turns out, all of the people assigned so far, except, as far as I know, the House investigating committees, are really compromised. The persons investigating the National Security Council, the Senate Committee investigating Irangate, Mr. Carlucci on the NSC, and David Abshire taking care of the White House business to cover the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies. All those people that came in to cover the bases after the scandals broke are very much a part of the problem, so that the independent probe right now is an impossibility. The San Francisco Examiner, November 30th, had a long story, Nicaragua rebels deny drug charges, plot to kill Ambassador Tams in Costa Rica, or to try to shoot Eden Pastora. Of course, that doesn't hold up at all, and as time goes on, it'll be shown that denial is baloney. The Washington Post, December the 9th, had a large full-page story. Swiss say General Secord and Oliver North are targets of investigations. This goes back to the Credit Suisse Bank in Switzerland, which was the money tree for Permindex for the murder of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, and for Permindex, the same operation that John Connally was running with Division 5 of the FBI involving these assassinations, and assisting Robert Vesco to try to get Dominica as a haven for Nazis and drug in the Caribbean, the same Swiss bank, Credit Suisse. In these times, December 16th, has a long story, Contra connection, dirty dealing in underground aid network, drugs and murders, and it cites Robert Owen and John Hall and Tom Posey and General John Singlau, the CIA, the National Security Council, and a cast of thousands. Each one of these articles, as I say, is entire full page of a newspaper or 2 pages. Some are even longer than that. People's World has a long story, December 16th, the CIA, the history of arms and drug deals. And it goes into the anti-Castro Cubans, Cuba under Batistas, the World Anti-Communist League, and those are the Nazi connections again to Vesco and Nazis, and the death squads used around the world. The Bay Guardian ran a large article December 3rd, that's the San Francisco Bay Area, called The Costa Rica Connection, and they have there the cast of characters that I cited, some of them earlier on the broadcast, 27 defendants of a lawsuit with charges of murder, attempted murder, gun running, narcotics traffic, and strong ties to the National Security Council and the White House. This article goes into CIA Director Thomas Cline's, Pablo Escobar, the partner of Letter Rivas, who was arrested this week, and a defendant in the Christic Institute, along with Jorge Osha, also a defendant, named again. Their name appears over and over in their links to assassinations and drug traffic. and the CIA and the National Security Council, and it also goes to the cocaine king and the cocaine traffic coming out of Colombia. This article goes into Albert Hakim, who took over TCI and made Stanford Technology, and General John Singlaub and Tom Posey and General Secord. Secord being a link with John Singlaub to Iran, the Middle East, to Mr. Hashemi, the late Hashemi, who was murdered in July, this past July, and Mr. Albert Hakim, defended in the Christic Institute. These names appear over and over, and soon you'll learn to know who they are and separate one from the other. But each one of these articles, as I say, is a full page of connecting links, each to be studied and very, very important. New Solidarity, December the 5th, has a story on the Boesky case, and there's been quite a few articles linking Ivan Boesky with persons involved with the narcotics traffic, with the Swiss banks, with Donald Reagan and Merrill Lynch, and Maxwell Raab, the ambassador to Italy at the present time, who's involved with these various persons and with gun going to Iran, and the same team that takes the money, puts it in Swiss banks, and then turns it over. We don't know where yet, but it could be going right to the drug dealers. In these times, had a long section, December the 20th, or one section was December the 10th, pardon me, titled, Is North Network Cocaine Connected? With a picture of Ollie North going into Colombia to Mr. Leda Rivas, Mr. Osho, and Garcia's testimony. People's World, December the 20th, a long section, Contras and Cocaine, the Plot Thickens, by Tim Wheeler, citing the links to George Bush, to the CIA, to the Colombia drug kings. New Solidarity, July 21st, 1986, U.S. Attorney William Weld out of Boston, Chief Justice for the Criminal Division now, and his links to Donald Reagan, to Merrill Lynch, to Credit Suisse Bank, again the Permindex Bank in Switzerland, the Bank of Boston, Edgar Bronfman, and he was president of Permindex and the Assassination Team Network. This article is a long article worth outlining. I'll do it for you and share that with you. Washington Times again had a long story. Senator John Kerry irks the Contras and Costa Rica with corruption probe. Again, this is Reverend Moon. This is Arnaud de Borchgrave, who works with Michael Ledeen, who was at the island of Grenada, who cooked up the story of Ajan the Bulgarians. And they're literally blaming Senator Kerry, for the murder of witnesses, as if he's bungling along. And the truth is, these witnesses cited Mr. Carr did in 9 letters that he was going to be killed, and he didn't know there was a Senator John Kerry at the time. Starting the first of the year, the Monterey Herald had a story, January the 1st, House launches new probe into alleged Contra drug deals. And another long story, January the 20th, in the Washington Post. Ex-airline tied to cocaine, Southern Airplane. Jorge Oshigan and the Medellin cartel. This is the Washington Post. The Guardian, January the 28th, are Reagan's gun runners drug pushers too. And this is a article saying, isn't this an embarrassment or contradiction to the Reagans who were anti-drug with their close ties that are getting thicker and larger. And these articles I cite from New Solidarity, People's World, the Washington Post, the Miami newspapers, the San Francisco Examiner, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. There's a good cross-section of articles to refer to these matters and the drug traffic as it closes in on those people that were mentioned in the suit in the Christic Institute, and also the necessity for bringing in Leda Rivas at this particular time. January the 19th, the New York Times has a story, Contra Arms Crews said to smuggle drugs. And the establishment newspaper, long to get into the act, is talking about drug smuggling, something that it took the People's World or the Executive Intelligence Review or the Guardian to publish a long time ago. Finally, the New York Times and Washington Post get into the act. The Los Angeles Herald had a story January the 18th. Inmate Jorge Morales Garcias and Gary Betzner were inside the jail in Miami, and they're talking about the Contras, cocaine traffic, the CIA, and their work with Adolfo Calera. Calera is the leader of the Contra movement at the present time. He's the defendant in the suit filed by Christic Institute, and I read today in the Wall Street Journal that they're trying to make arrangements by the State Department to remove Mr. Calera, which is absolutely necessary because as these suits evolve and there's so much evidence that they can be proved guilty no matter how corrupt the courts are, then Mr. Calero has to be eased out. There was talk today about removing him, just as they had to bring Letter Rivas home and put a sound wall around him, I suppose, so he can't have interviews. But the necessity to cover up the drug deals involves killing primary witnesses or changing jobs and putting somebody in their place. The article I cited before that is very important, Who Runs the Contra Cocaine Connection, written by Gretchen Small, was published January 23rd, Executive Intelligence Review. And of course, the kingpin of all of this, that is the man cited in these articles, is Robert Vesco. And Vesco has strong links to the Nazis, to the Klan, to Permindex, to Richard Allen, to William Casey. And that's why he's out loose in the Caribbean there, because he knows his way around all those little inlets, and he had his own airport, airstrip, and private home, as I say, that Mr. Hull, the defendant in the Christic Institute, is sharing now. The People's World had a large article January 30th, the Iran-Contragate Drug Connections, and it goes into the Middle East drugs to Central and South America drugs. It's written by Con Hallinan, and he's well known in the Bay Area, and it involves Philippe Vidal, Rene Corbeau, Jorge Osha, Pablo Escobar. Some of these names you might begin to get familiar with. The Indochina War in Laos, Theodore Shackley's drug dealing in Southeast Asia, Santos Traficante, and this is part of the connection of the Miami John Kennedy assassination team, and V.A.N. Pao, P-A-O, Traficante, as I say, was working with John Rosselli and Sam Giancana and Mo Dalitz and the CIA and Robert Mayhew on the role of probably getting even. They were used because they could get even with Robert Kennedy, who was going to arrest the drug dealers, and the powers that be wanted John Kennedy gotten rid of anyway. And as soon as he was murdered, the war escalated, and then General Richard Secord and Thomas Cline and Theodore Shackley and all these people got very rich off the narcotics of Southeast Asia. This article is about Shackley and Traficante and so forth, and the Nugan Hand Bank, and the full cycle of international fascists and Nazis and drug dealers linked to the National Security Council and the Central Intelligence Agency. And the San Jose Metro had an article which I cited last week, which I want to put in this category, December the 12th, 1986, called The Arms Dealer Next Door. And again, this is a different article about Albert Hakim than the one I mentioned before, but it cites the fact that Helene von Damme, Reagan's secretary for 8 years in California and his appointment secretary in Washington for 2 administrations, has been working with Hakim in Austria at various safe houses or whatever. And these people are involved in a lot of activities that have taken place over the past years of political assassinations. They don't stay in their own backyard. They can travel and kill anywhere they want. And this is really the Division 5 of FBI that was run out of Oaxaca, Mexico for a long, long time, and then moved allegedly to Rhodesia, but had full support and activities in Chile, at Colonia Dignidad, the area between Chile and Argentina, a safe haven for Nazis who needed to get their fingerprints changed if possible, faces fixed if possible. And Michael Townley works down at Colonia Dignidad with various persons involved in these Nazi drug dealing operations. And so I don't think, going back again to the arrest this week of the gentleman involved with the killing of Orlando Letelier, he said the far right would kill him, and he wanted protection in the United States. I bet you he won't be here very long or be safe very long. Now, for the remaining time of the program, I'm going to share with you the first part of the article, Who Runs the Contra Cocaine Connection? It was published in 1987, written by Gretchen Small. It was published in EIR, Executive Intelligence Review. And then I'll continue with it next week because it is very, very important. This article begins by citing Justice Department spokesman Patrick Korten, K-O-R-T-E-N, who had to address himself to charges placed in 1985 or mentioned in 85 that the Contras were in drug operations. The Justice Department agent Patrick Korten said, "We have investigated all the accusations, in some cases exhaustively, and we found no substantial evidence which supports them." Justice Department spokesman Patrick Korten said August 14, 1986, reporting the results of the Justice Department investigation into charges that the Nicaraguan Contras ran narcotics. The Justice Department statement was even more sweeping than the one handed to Congress April the 16th, 1986. That was an earlier report by Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs Elliot Abrams. Now, Abrams is very much involved in these operations, and the article says Abrams himself is involved in the day-to-day affairs of the Contras. Some Contras say that some Contras may have engaged in some activity. Abrams released a note, read it out to the public, but it was, insofar as we can determine, without the authorization of the resistance leaders. The limited number of incidences found occurred during an 18-month period when the Contras were getting no U.S. assistance, leaving them particularly hard-pressed for financial support. What Abrams was saying was that we drove the Contras to narcotics traffic because Congress didn't give them the $100 million they wanted. It was Elliot Abrams who went down to the Sultan of Brunei to get $10 million and to put in the same joint Swiss bank account of the Nazi fascist cocaine dealers, run for them out of Switzerland and then down to the Panama and the Bahamas and these various islands. Abrams took the money from the Sultan of Brunei, and now it can't be traced, and easily could have been put into narcotics in Pakistan and then parlayed to much bigger street money here in the United States after it left Afghanistan, allegedly earmarked for that country and then going into drug traffic elsewhere. Time will go on to prove just how much of a liar Elliot Abrams is. The article continues, no substantial evidence, that they couldn't find any evidence of narcotics traffic of the Contras. The independent counsel in charge of Iran-Gate investigations, Mr. Lawrence Walsh, decided to take over the investigations into all the Contra narcotics connections and has asked the Justice Department to hand over their relevant files. So this will be an interesting conflict. How much Mises Justice Department hid drug dealers at the time that Nancy Reagan was running this great anti-drug campaign to give her a job of prominence alongside the president, saving our nation from the drug network. Her own Justice Department, the president's Justice Department, were covering up known narcotic traffickers who were pouring hundreds of millions of dollars of cocaine into the United States just from Florida alone every single week. So the Justice Department has to turn over the information, the relevant files, upon which they came to the conclusion that the narcotics traffic was just a runaway group. Included in those files, according to the Wall Street Journal on January the 9th, is the testimony of a witness that bags of cocaine were loaded into Southern Air Transport cargo plane in Colombia in 1985, the very same plane that was shot down over Nicaragua October the 5th, 1986, ferrying weapons to the Contras. The same airline, the same plane, the same pilots involved in drug traffic with these operations, and this particular plane was seen in Colombia with being loaded with the drugs and made a full cycle back to Florida, and then it blew up over Nicaragua, was blown up, and Mr. Hassenfuss was on that plane. Gretchen Small continues, the political fallout of the NAR-Contra, they refer to it as the narcotics Contra, has only begun to hit the United States. As the full story of the Contra cocaine connections comes to light, United States officials complicit in the Contra drug trafficking, those who covered up the traffic, and any official who defends drug running on the grounds that drug traffickers were forced to do it because they were financially hard-pressed at the time, faces the wrath of an American public that has discovered the names of those who murdered its children through drugs. Now, the idea that Ronald Reagan is sending and has been sending arms to Iran after so many hostages, 52, were kept over 1 year in silence and kept away from their families as hostages, there was so much anger towards Iran that the shock of this story was compounded by people realizing the president has been arming Khomeini all this time since the hostage-taking and working with the very people who had them. Now, the next affront to Ronald Reagan's administration, the reason I cited those long articles, is the fact that the drug dealing goes right to the White House, and he's using his wife to put on a front of trying to stop drug activities, while his foreign policy is run by drug traffickers. And as this article says, the story's only beginning to hit the United States. As the full story comes out, there'll be more anger as people who suffered at the hands of drug dealers, whether robbed, mugged, or family members murdered, realize that the drug trafficking goes right to the White House. The article continues, from day one of the Reagan administration, EIR warned President Reagan that if he accepted the Contra policy for Central America, the administration would sooner or later face a Watergate of insurmountable proportions. The Contras are drug runners. We warned them, if they receive the United States government support, no credibility will be left to the new administration's war on drugs. And certainly that not only has been taken away, but Reagan has taken away the funds for war on drugs. The article continues, President Reagan didn't listen. He succumbed indeed to blackmail and pressures of the Trilateral Commission, whose leading members include Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger, who designed the Contra policy. Unless the United States support for Contras is immediately halted, and this is written January 87, and those responsible prosecuted, President Reagan may yet pay the price for that error. And goodness knows how heavy the price is going to be through the years. It's time to close now. The hour is up. I can't finish this article now, but I think if all goes well, as predicted, I'll start the program with it next week. It's a very, very important link of Vesco to the drug runners and to the White House, and puts a lot of the missing pieces together about the Swiss banks and so forth. This is Mae Brussell concluding this section on the drug traffic, the cocaine, the White House, and the CIA and the Defense Department. I'll be back with you next week to continue along those lines, just showing the double hypocrisy of the entire State Department, intelligence community, and the White House, and making us suckers for their lies while they make profits off the drug traffic. Now they're going to pay the price for it. This is May. Again, I'll be back with you next week. Take care and keep clipping those articles and reading them. It is a fascinating time to be studying American history.